There is a silent pain many believers carry for years, but never name. They pray sincerely. They ask for peace. They ask for clarity. They ask for change, and yet their life keeps repeating the same pattern, the same tension, the same heaviness, the same sense that something is blocked. Sooner or later, a dangerous suspicion begins to form. Maybe prayer is not working. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I'm asking God for what my inner life cannot yet hold. Jesus addressed this exact frustration in one of the most misunderstood sentences he ever spoke. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. For centuries, religion treated that sentence like a mysterious spiritual slogan, something symbolic, something ceremonial, something reserved for religious leaders or invisible battles. But what if that sentence is not vague at all? What if it is actually one of the most compressed descriptions of reality and physics Jesus ever gave? Because hidden inside those words is a possibility that is both unsettling and deeply personal. That your inner world and your outer world may not be separate systems. And if that is true, then most people are not suffering from a lack of desire. They are suffering from disconnection. That is the hidden ache beneath this verse. Not simply the desire for blessing, but the longing to understand why inner reality and outer experience feel so strangely entangled. Because most people do not want fantasy. They want coherence. They want to know why their heart says one thing, their mouth says another, and their life seems to obey neither. Now notice the structure of what Jesus said. He did not say, "Whatever heaven binds will appear on earth." He said, "Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven." That reverses the order people expect, and that reversal is important, because Jesus is not describing passive spirituality. He's describing participation. Earth first, then heaven. Visible action, then invisible consequence. Embodied decision, then unseen correspondence. This is not the language of religious theater. It is the language of interdependence. Two domains, mutually responsive, and that is where the discomfort begins. Because if earth and heaven are connected, then what you tolerate externally, rehearse internally, and reinforce behaviorally may be shaping more than your mood. It may be setting the pattern your life continues to inhabit. Ancient people did not divide reality the way modern minds do. For them, heaven was not merely a future destination beyond death. Heaven referred to the unseen order of things, the invisible layer, the hidden architecture beneath appearances, the realm of pattern, meaning intelligence and structure. Earth was the visible realm, matter, behavior, circumstance, embodiment. So when Jesus speaks of binding on earth and binding in heaven, he is not speaking about two disconnected locations. He is describing two layers of one reality, the visible and the invisible, the embodied and the informational, the lived pattern and the deeper order beneath it. Modern people use different words: field, system, information, pattern recognition, neural encoding, behavioral loops. Different vocabulary, same intuition. What is seen is shaped by what is unseen, and what is repeated in the seen world reinforces structure in the unseen. This is why so many people fail to understand their own suffering. They think they are just reacting to life, but often they are participating in a pattern they do not know how to name. They keep binding what they hope to escape. They bind anxiety by rehearsing catastrophe. They bind confusion by living in overstimulation. They bind relational pain by repeating defensive behaviors. They bind spiritual numbness by flooding the nervous system with noise while asking for clarity, and all the while, they remain confused about why heaven feels silent. But heaven may not be silent. It may be mirroring structure, not punishing, not withholding, mirroring. Because reality often amplifies what is stabilized, and stabilization happens through repetition. Modern neuroscience helps us understand one layer of this. The brain is not a neutral camera. It is a prediction engine. It does not simply observe the world as it is. It constructs an interpretation based on prior patterns, emotional memories, attentional bias, and embodied expectation. Which means something very important. Your inner state is not private in the way you assume. It shapes what you notice, what you miss, what you interpret as threat, what you interpret as opportunity, what kind of tone you bring into a room, what kind of response you unconsciously invite from others. So when your nervous system is saturated with fear, urgency, or fragmentation, you do not merely feel different, you perceive differently. And perception changes behavior. Behavior changes outcomes. Outcomes reinforce beliefs. Beliefs further shape perception. This is how invisible patterns become lived reality. Not through magic, through repeated coherence or repeated incoherence. That is why this verse is not about mystical control. It is about the terrifying responsibility of alignment. What are you binding through your daily agreement? What are you loosening through your refusal to sustain it? People often think binding means shouting at darkness. But in many cases, binding begins much earlier. It begins with attention. What do you repeatedly attach your mind to? What do you rehearse? What do you normalize? What do you emotionally revisit until it becomes familiar? Because familiarity becomes internal structure, and internal structure eventually becomes lived territory. The public version of your life is often downstream from private repetition. Now let's move from psychology into physics carefully. In 1935, Einstein and his colleagues described a phenomenon that deeply unsettled classical assumptions about reality. Quantum entanglement. Two particles interact, then they separate. Yet after separation, they continue to behave as though some invisible connection remains. A change in one appears correlated with the other, even across distance. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance because it challenged the ordinary intuition that objects only influence each other through direct local contact. Physics does not prove theology, but it does humble modern certainty. It reminds us that reality may be more relational, more connected, and more structurally mysterious than the surface suggests. And when Jesus speaks of earth and heaven in responsive relation, the statement no longer sounds primitive. It sounds disturbingly precise, not as laboratory science, but as metaphysical insight with practical consequences. And this is where the public's hidden desire begins to emerge. They do not only want blessing, they want to feel that their inner work matters. They want to believe that silence is not wasted, that attention is not trivial, that emotional regulation is not merely therapeutic but consequential, that integrity has structure, that peace is not sentiment but alignment. Because deep down, many people already sense this. They have felt the difference between entering a room fragmented and entering a room regulated. They have felt the difference between speaking from fear and speaking from clarity. They have felt how one person's chaos can destabilize everyone around them, and how one person's calm can reorganize the atmosphere. That is not fantasy. That is field influence at the human level. The nervous system transmits. Presence carries signal. And Jesus lived as if this was obvious. Look at the pattern across the series so far. Speak to the mountain, regulate power, confront the shadow, withdraw into silence. None of these teachings begin externally. Jesus never starts with outer conquest. He always begins with inner order. Because external authority without internal coherence becomes performance, and performance eventually collapses. But when perception, emotion, attention, and embodied action align, something changes. Your presence acquires weight. Your words stop leaking energy. Your reactions stop binding chaos. Your habits stop reinforcing fragmentation. Your environment begins responding to a different signal. This is not instant manifestation. This is structured participation. And it is far more demanding than motivational spirituality, because it requires you to stop blaming disconnected outcomes on fate alone. It asks what you are reinforcing. It asks where your agreements truly are. Not what you say you want, what you repeatedly stabilize. This is where false spirituality quietly sabotages people. Performative spirituality focuses on language without structure. It says the right words but ignores the nervous system. It chases mystical feelings but neglects repeated attention. It asks heaven for peace while feeding the body constant stimulation. It speaks about surrender while silently clinging to control. That is dissonance. And dissonance binds confusion. The public language sounds spiritual. The embodied frequency remains anxious, and the system responds to the deeper signal. Because what shapes reality is not the slogan you recite once. It is the pattern you inhabit repeatedly. So what does binding and loosing look like in ordinary life? Binding is what happens when you repeatedly reinforce what should have been interrupted. You bind resentment when you rehearse the injury every day. You bind fear when you feed it constant images and call it discernment. You bind powerlessness when you narrate your life as something happening only to you. Loosing is what happens when coherent interruption begins. You loosen anxiety when you stop consenting to endless internal rehearsal. You loosen confusion when you reduce stimulation and rebuild silence. You loosen shame when hidden patterns are named and brought into awareness. You loosen fragmentation when body, attention, and intention start agreeing again. Binding is reinforced entanglement. Loosing is disciplined release, and both begin long before visible results appear. They begin in attention, in agreement, in repetition. This is also why many people feel exhausted by trying to control the future. They are not merely tired from effort. They are tired from internal contradiction. One part of them asks for peace. Another part rehearses disaster. One part asks for divine timing. Another part grips urgency. One part says, "I trust." Another part scans constantly for signs of failure. This splits the signal, and a split signal cannot generate coherence. The nervous system receives mixed instructions. Perception becomes unstable. Behavior becomes inconsistent. Then people call the resulting confusion a closed door or a spiritual attack, when much of the time it is unresolved internal conflict becoming visible. Not all resistance is external. Sometimes it is entanglement within. So how do you begin practicing this verse without turning it into mysticism or control? First, examine agreement. What are you repeatedly consenting to in thought, tone, behavior, and attention? Not what you occasionally fear, what you regularly reinforce. Second, reduce hidden bindings. Notice what drains coherence: overstimulation, compulsive checking, rehearsed resentment, emotionally loaded self-talk, the constant urge to predict and control. Third, practice deliberate loosing. Create spaces where the nervous system is not rebinding chaos. Silence, observation, regulated breathing, truthful speech, embodied stillness, fewer words, greater congruence. This is not self-help technique for its own sake. It is a way of restoring structural agreement between the visible and the invisible. And now, the verse begins to sound different. Whatever you bind on earth, what do you bind through repeated embodiment, will be bound in heaven. What structure are you reinforcing in the unseen architecture of your life? And whatever you loose on earth, what are you finally interrupting, releasing, refusing to keep feeding, will be loosed in heaven. What becomes possible once your agreement changes? The verse is not asking for drama. It is asking for seriousness. It is asking you to see that inner life, outer behavior, and unseen consequence are not isolated categories. They are linked. And Jesus spoke as if human beings were meant to live awake to that link. So perhaps the hidden pain behind this verse is not just spiritual confusion. It is the ache of living divided, wanting one thing, reinforcing another, praying upward while living inwardly fragmented. And the hidden desire is not simply to get results. It is to become coherent enough that prayer has weight again, to feel that faith is not performance, that peace is not passivity, that inner order is not abstract, that heaven is not distant from earth, but responsive to what is embodied here. In the end, binding and loosing is not about religious theater. It is about participation in a reality that is more connected than most people dare to admit. The visible and the invisible, earth and heaven, perception and behavior, attention and outcome, not separate systems, but interwoven layers. And if that is true, then what you cultivate internally will not remain internal forever. It will shape the world you step into, not instantly, not mechanically, but structurally. And Jesus spoke about that structure as if it was not hidden at all, only forgotten. Welcome back to the Mechanics of Faith.